am delighted to join you in declaring November 2021 to be National Native American History Month. During National Native American Heritage Month, we come together as a community to celebrate our city's rich Native American history, culture, and community. Every Portlander should be invested in the history of the relationship between the city of Portland and Portland's Native American community, because the history of Native peoples in the Willamette Valley is also Portland's origin story. And this story contains many grim chapters. The land that we know as Portland has been occupied by Native Americans for at least 11,000 years. The names of the peoples who first lived on these lands are still familiar to us. There were the Clackamas, Willamette, Multnomah, and Tualatin peoples. Those people lived, loved, and thrived on the lands that we now call Portland from about 8,000 BC to the early 1800s, when the first white people arrived in the Willamette Valley. That first crew of white people arrived in Portland in 1805. You might have heard of them, Lewis and Clark. Of course, we should remember that the members of Lewis's and Clark's expedition included a young Native American woman, known to most Americans as Sacagawea, and a Black man, whose name was York. Shortly after Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, and York's expedition visited the Pacific Northwest, more white explorers, fur trappers, missionaries, and settlers arrived in the Willamette Valley. That wave of European immigrants brought American civilization to the Pacific Northwest, including the local governments that we serve in today. White settlers also brought diseases like smallpox and measles, which devastated the indigenous populations here in Portland. Between the early 1800s and the 1850s, those plagues killed between 50 and 90% of the Native Americans who lived in the Portland Basin. Then in 1850, Congress passed the Organ Donation Land Law, which, quote, granted every white settler 160 acres of Oregon public lands. Of course, these public lands were seized from the indigenous peoples of the Willamette Valley. And it is no coincidence that the city of Portland was incorporated 1 year after the Organ Donation Land Law was signed into law. Now, despite disease, displacement, and disfranchisement, Portland's Native American community has persevered. Today, nearly 60,000 Native Americans live in the Portland area, which makes Portland the 9th largest urban Native American population in the United States. Although Portland's indigenous communities are thriving today, they are also still healing from more than 2 centuries of discrimination. Today in Portland, poverty rates in Native communities are 3 times higher than poverty rates in white communities. Today in Portland, unemployment rates among Native Americans are 70% higher than unemployment rates amongst white Portlanders. Today in Portland, more than 20% of Native Americans experience hunger on a monthly basis. Colleagues, the uncomfortable truth is that the economic disadvantages Native American Portlanders face today are a direct product of the practices and policies of the past and the present. Colleagues, we cannot undo the wrongs of the past, but we can commit to do better in this present and the future. And that's why Native American Heritage Month is so important. During Native American Heritage Month, this council reaffirms its commitment to preserving indigenous cultures, languages, places, and history. During Native American Heritage Month, this council reaffirms our commitment to respecting tribal sovereignty and honoring tribal treaties. During Native American Heritage Month, this council reaffirms our commitment to bringing economic equality and economic opportunity to today's and future generations of Native peoples. And during Native American Heritage Month, this council recognizes our partners who are helping to write the next chapter in the history of the relationship between the city of Portland and our Native neighbors. That's why I want to recognize the great work done by the City of Portland's Office of Tribal Relations. In particular, I'd like to congratulate Laura John and her team for recently pulling together a wildly successful Tribal Relations Summit. In addition, I'd like to thank the City of Portland's Indigenous PDX Affinity Group for helping organize this proclamation and for their advocacy on behalf of Portland's Native American public servants. I would also like to recognize the amazing work done by the Native American Youth and Family Center. And I would like to take a moment to share how proud I am of the good folks over at the Jim Pepper Native Arts Council. The Jim Pepper Native Arts Council is a nonprofit group which provides music education to Native American high school students. Many years ago, I sat on their board, and I am in awe of what that organization is doing these days. Now, colleagues, before I wrap up my comments today, I want to share one last bit of Native American history with you that I think about a lot, and I hope it gives you something to think about too. Now, I have a question. Have you ever wondered why some major streets in Portland are on a diagonal? You know how Sandy Boulevard and Foster Boulevard cut through our regular street grids in a weird way? Where does that come from? The answer is ancient. Our diagonal boulevards like Sandy and Foster follow the roots of major Indian paths established prior to white people arriving on these lands. In other words, Portland's diagonal boulevards are literally an example of how the paths cut by ancient Native Americans shape the paths Portlanders walk today. Revisiting memories like that is what Native American History Month is all about. Native American History Month is an invitation to all Portlanders to learn more about the influence our Native American ancestors have had on Portland, the Portland we know and love today. That's why I am delighted to join you in declaring November 2021 to be Native American Heritage Month. Thank you.